Hi there guys, so there was a really interesting article on the BBC website yesterday where they talked about the lengths that the Scottish prison system are having to go to keep gang members separate, and that's with a view to keeping violence to an absolute minimum. Now in this video I want to talk a little bit about why this is a sort of false economy really, and why sort of dealing with prisoners in this way is almost a waste of time. Not to say that we don't have to do it, because we do, but what I'm going to argue is that if we structured our society slightly differently, we wouldn't have to put up with this level of criminality in the first place. So let's have a quick look at the article and then I'll take it from there. So it says the Scottish Prison Service says more inmates are being held in segregation than ever before amid a rise in attacks linked to serious organised crime groups. The service's chief executive says the recent Gangland feud in central Scotland has raised the temperature behind bars and that staff are carrying out a heroic task in overcrowded jails. The Prison Officers Association says many of its members have been left fearing for their safety because of threats and intimidation from gang-affiliated criminals. Justice Secretary Angela Constant said the Scottish Government was aware of the impact of the rise of inmates and organised crime on the prison system and was working with partners to reduce the harm caused. Scotland's prison population stood at 8,251 this week. About 660 of those inmates are thought to have strong gang associations, and many others are linked to lower level local gangs. So it's a pretty bleak picture, isn't it? And we've known for many years that the prison system in the UK is absolutely on its arse. The long-standing difficulties that we've got with our prison system, it's been turbocharged by austerity, by outsourcing, and by our mad sort of criminal justice policies where we lock people up for stealing a bottle of water and other mad stuff like that. So you're dealing with overcrowding, epidemic of violence, drug use, you name it, it's all going on behind bars. I wanted to take a slightly different look at this today and think about how we could prevent people from getting involved in serious organised crime or from joining gangs in the first place. Because I'm going to make the point here that there's absolutely no point trying to intervene once these people are embedded in a life of criminality and once they've become adults. Only a very tiny minority are going to be able to turn their lives around once they've reached adulthood and are heavily involved in organised crime. No, ultimately this is going to come down to early intervention for children at a much earlier age and community resources for parents and families. So I've worked with kids on the edge of care and I've worked with kids on the edge of the criminal justice system. And there's one thing that is always consistent about how they present and their situation, and that is their home life. So, whether they're living in families where there's domestic abuse, mental health issues, drug or alcohol issues, chaotic family environment, or just grinding poverty, you always have this sort of series of push and pull factors in those families that leads these children into criminality. So the push factors typically being the sort of chaos and the lack of love and boundaries at home, and the pull factors being the lure of, easy money and a family environment via the gang. And I use inverted commas there because it's not easy and it's not a family. It's just pure manipulation and grooming of vulnerable young people. But if you want to get on top of these issues at an early age and actually make a difference, rather than wait for these children and then later adults to go to prison, you really need effective identification of the families who are having difficulties, and then you need a really wide package of support to help them. Sadly in our society, most of that is going to have to come from the state. But that's not to say that there aren't opportunities to use the community and the wider family when appropriate. Ultimately, you need to get help to parents with their parenting. So, offering them advice around parenting skills, helping parents to get off drugs and alcohol, helping parents with their mental health. And ideally, you need sort of tangible ways to get people out of poverty. Now, to do this is obviously a massive undertaking, and often you're fighting against sort of generations worth of deprivation and social problems. But ultimately it's worth doing, because otherwise you end up with the problems as outlined in this report on the BBC. Our prison systems just end up being a sort of dumping ground for children and adults who could have been supported at a much younger and earlier stage. And again, I always go back to this in my videos. What you can't do is sort of impose austerity on society and then expect good outcomes for troubled families. The reality with austerity was always that the state was being hacked back and the supportive functions of the state were being hacked back. And that in turn was a false economy, because ultimately what happened was the needs of vulnerable families went unmet, and then the children within those families then grew up into adults, and lo and behold, they join a gang or they commit a crime and then they're in prison. So in summary, I think we need a fundamental change in the way our society is structured to bring about the changes that I've talked about in this video, and to ensure that families are supported from day dot. We need local communities and the state working together. and we actually have to fund our preventative services rather than just putting money at the back end when it's too late and when they're in prison. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, guys. Please let me know in the comments what you think about this. What would be your solution to dealing with the crisis in our prison system? Thanks a lot, guys. See you in the next one.